Howdy all, this is Shane. It's a wet Friday afternoon in Melbourne, Australia, and I thought I'd do another podcast, and this time we're going to talk about amplifiers and speakers. I'm not going to get so much into the tone debate or anything like that about what I think's better. This is just more of my personal understanding and experience, changing out speakers, different amplifiers, and all of that good stuff. So first thing I'm going to start with what I consider to be the most important part of buying an amp. You need to ask yourself a couple of questions. What do I need to get the sound that I want? And what kind of setup do I need? Is it easier for me to, say, get a separate head and a speaker box and then I can change out the speaker box? Or is it easier just to get a combo where everything's built in, and sometimes extending them out with more speakers can be a bit more tough? So what I tend to do is I buy different amps for not only different sounds but for different gigs. I got a great little 15 watt Vox AC15 now, and that's loud enough for most venues that we play. Occasionally it does struggle when it's like when we're at our loudest, but then I also have the in-between, which is a 45 watt Fender tube amp with a single 12, which also does the blues and the funk kind of thing really, really well, but it's just got that little bit of extra headroom. I gotta say, I'm leaning towards Vox amps these days. I just think that's the sound that I've kind of been looking for. It's just a personal thing, not to say it's better than the Fender to other people. I've had many Fender amps and they're great. It's just a personal choice, which is the thing that everyone needs to make when they buy an amp. If you like the sound of someone else's tone and you buy the same amp, it may actually sound different. And like I explained in the last one, it's down to the playing and what the person hears in their head when they play. But for me, I know if my Fender amp isn't the one I want, but I still want it louder, I've got an AC30. I'm lucky enough to have the 3 amps. It's probably more than I do need. I could probably get away with 2. But the fact is, I really love having the Fender because it is different, and occasionally that amp's just the one to go to. Where the AC30 might be too heavy, or the car's too full, or I've just got things against me where the AC15 might not be loud enough. The thing I love about the small amps, especially the AC15, I can just plug straight into that with no pedals and it sounds brilliant. And that's a perfect jam amp and a rehearsal amp. Not that I really rehearse, but it would be perfect for that situation. Where the Fender sounds better, louder, it doesn't sound as good at a sort of more moderate volume. That's my only criticism or experience with it. I think while the Fenders sound great at a lower volume, you kind of need pedals to get that sound that you want. Once you've dialed it in, it sounds great. But yeah, the AC30, I use that. It's got a big full sound. I know that's going to be loud enough, but the downside of it is heavy. So I tend to try and work out a room. I'll bring a smaller amp, and then next time, if it's not big enough, I can bring one of the monsters down. But yeah, so ask yourself, what do I need this amp for? What kind of sound do I want? And do other people, how many other people have it? And that's another thing which I think makes people stand out. If you can get a sound that doesn't sound like 5 of your friends have all Fender amps, maybe try and find something a little different and break the mold, and your sound will definitely stand out. If 5 of your friends have Marshall amps, maybe go for Fender, if that's in the same vein of music that you want to play, of course. I wouldn't say go buy a Fender amp if you want to go play metal, unless you've got a shitload of pedals. That's not really a good investment. So I try to ask myself, like, what do I need? What kind of music am I playing? What guitar do I have? And that's a big thing too. I found Gibsons don't shine through Fender amps. I know that's not always the case, but in my experience, I've had a couple of humbucker Gibson guitars and Epiphones and so forth. And I never really got the sound I wanted out of my Fender amp with it. I came close a couple of times, but it always had a pedal in front of it for me to get it to sound the way that I wanted. And the Vox and the Telecaster just sound so good together. They were made to work together. Years ago I had a Yorkville Trainer amplifier, which really worked well with my Epiphone 335. Like, that was as good a sound as I could get at the time. And listening back to the videos, that was still a great investment and a good combination. So if you're playing a Strat, you could get a Fender amp, or you could get a Marshall. There's so many proven combinations of amp and guitar that really work, but you've got to be happy with the sound, and you've got to be got to have an idea in your head of what you want as well before you go out and just start spending money. And, you know, unfortunately, like what I did for many, many years, too many years actually, was to go out and buy amps and then, you know, ask questions later. And, you know, I doubled up in certain areas. I had a couple of Fender amps here, I had a couple of PV amps there. While I could get good tones out of most of them, some nights I'd struggle getting the sound that I want. I should have just stuck to maybe two amps or 3 amps, or just one that could cover all of the range of things. Like if I only had to keep 1 amp right now, it'd be the AC30, and I would get rid of both of the other ones, only because I know that amp will be loud enough for any situation. It still sounds pretty good at a low volume, but the thing is, it's so heavy. It's just an absolute backbreaker, and it's up there with like your Fender Twin and your Rivera 212s, and it's actually heavier than those. So if you get a big amp, be prepared to put up with a lot of ridicule from your friends when they don't want to help you lift it, because they get up to like 40 kilos, which is around 82 pounds or something. So they start to weigh as much as like a small child or whatever. Yeah, just be prepared if you buy a big amp that it's going to fill a lot more space in your car. It's going to be harder to get around. Make sure you buy a trolley if you need one, which is what I do to get that big amp around. You know, I got to get it to the car, but once it's in the car, it's cool. If I got to walk to the gig, I've always got a trolley. I never, ever lift that thing and just walk with it anymore. If I have a choice, I always take the trolley with me. It's just one of those things. Now, to get a good tube tone, most people think they have to get a high watt output amplifier, like say they want a 100 watt amp for a gig. It's actually like unnecessary, and you'll never really get the full benefit of having the tubes unless it's absolutely cranked or you play a lot of like loud heavy metal music. But in terms of tone, to get the sound that I like, I have to actually work the power amp of the amp to some extent. Now, I like amps that I can turn up loud and it's not chopping everybody's head off. So I'll never buy another 212 amp that has more than 30 watts. Only because that's plenty loud with 2 speakers. It sounds full, it sounds awesome, but it's just more than enough volume. I even had a crate 30 watt combo, a V30, one of the USA made ones from a while back. And that thing cooked, and it was way loud enough. Like, it was super loud at 30 watts. And I've also tried the PV Delta Blues, which was always loud enough for any gig I've done. I mean, granted, the style of music I play is more blues and funk, as I was mentioning, but it's definitely loud enough for most gigs. A 45 watt amp will give you a better clean headroom, which is something people might want if they want a big clean tone. But you'll find, once you push the Fenders up past 5, they're excruciatingly loud, and they'll start to break up anyway. So if you're a jazz dude or whatever, even jazz guys wouldn't want that loud an amp. It's just unnecessary. They'll probably mic it up and have something at a lower volume, so take that into consideration. If you're doing gigs where you're miking up your stage and performers, a 15 watt amp cranked will sound better out through the front of house than like a 50 watt amp on low. It just, there's no comparison, because you want your amp to work to give you the sound that you want. And especially in blues, I found the harder you push an amp, or the further you've got the master volume up, and the less you've got the pre-gain or preamp up, the better you're going to sound if the amp's working hard. There's exceptions, like on a 30 watt amp, I won't have the master at the same volume. I'll still have a bit of preamp gain, but the overall sound it gives you, or gives me, is very, very similar at that volume. So it's very cool. It's very cool trying to work out what sound you want and what amp you want. But don't just buy another amp because you want a different sound. I think when you make a decision to buy something, make sure that it's going to suit something that you want to achieve. If you want 2 different tones, that's cool. I just don't think, if you've been playing Fender amps or you got a couple of different amps, and then you say you want a Marshall, but you're not sure why you want one, you just want to go get one, that's probably not a good enough reason to go buy another amp. I think if you say, I wish I had a 15 watt amp so I could crank it, that kind of makes sense. If you've got a 45 watt amp, I could see why you'd want something small for different rooms, and that makes complete sense. And it's good decision making to do something that will fit a practical use. You know, if you've got a Fender Twin and you don't want to turn that up at home, then you could go buy like a little practice amp or something. That makes sense too, but I don't think buying like 3 or 4 of the same type of amps is really of any benefit. It's good to have a backup. If you're a working muso like myself, it's always good to have an extra amp or a different sound to suit recording purposes as well. That's another thing. Or to suit, if one breaks down, you got another one in reserve, or you can just get a variation of sounds. And occasionally you might even run 2 amps at the same time, which I've only really done like 2 or 3 times, but that can be fun for some funky effects on the delay and so forth. But I think what it comes down to is just making a purchase that makes sense, and not only makes sense to the practical side, but makes sense in its application has to be important. So take that into consideration and get the sound you want. Get an amp that suits what you're doing. If you decide later on that you want an amp where you might need an extra speaker plugged into it or something like that, then go down that route and check out what you can do to get the best of what you can get without blowing a lot of cash. So a little bit of forethought would have saved me a lot of bucks in the past. So I'm glad I'm at that point now where I don't just hear an amp and I still might want to go buy it. It's also good to be a little different. So keep some originality and don't just follow the rest of the sheep. And the last thing I can recommend is if you've got a pretty good tone already, but you find maybe your sound's a little muddy or you can't quite get what you want, changing out the speaker can make a huge difference. But I really suggest looking into speakers before you just go buy another one, because sometimes when you buy another speaker, it'll change the tone and you might think it sounds better, and then you'll hear the original speaker again and you'll kind of prefer that. So try to find a speaker that will add what you need to the sound, find out what other people are using, and base a purchase off that. If you find, like what I did with my Fender Blues Deluxe, I found it to be too brittle and sharp with the stock Eminence speaker. I mean, Eminence make great speakers, but they don't make good standard Fender speakers. They're junk. In my opinion, I don't like them at all. They're too brittle and harsh. And in the Blues Deluxe, it really sort of emphasized the sharpness, and I didn't like that at all. So I wanted to roll off the top end and get a nice open warm sound. So I went for a Lowrance Greenback. But how did I find out about that? I just asked a lot of people and wanted to know what they used and what they thought was a good speaker. And then finally got to hear one, and I was blown away by them. I also really love the Century G12 vintage speakers by Celestion. They're just awesome. They add nice clarity. If you find your sound's a little muddy, that's a great choice to go for. And there's a lot of standards that people use that are proven to be good for certain types of music. So do some research before you go just buy any speaker. Make sure other guitar players have used them, and make sure that they're, they suit what you want from them. Don't just buy one that will roll off all the top end if you find you already got a muddy tone. That's not really going to help. So try to find the speaker that will work best for the sound you want, and you can only really do that through trial and error or asking people what they think. So there's plenty of choices. Just keep an open mind and an open ear, and if you can get to a shop that might have a selection of speaker cabinets, try them out. See what speakers are in there, see which sound speaks to you, and go from there. So changing the speaker will be as big a change almost as changing amps in some ways. So I'd say even more so than putting new pickups in. I'd reckon that a speaker is a good 30% of the sound that you're going to get. Check them out, make a good decision, and if you're already happy with your stock speaker, then there's no reason to change.